What does Solomon's prayer of dedication tell us about the forgiveness of God? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Chronicles on Walking Through the Bible.
Glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 12 to 21. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 12. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Chronicles chapter 6, beginning at verse 12. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands. For Solomon had made a bronze platform, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high, and had set it in the midst of the court. And he stood on it, knelt down on his knees before all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands towards heaven, and he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven or on earth like you, who keep your covenant and mercy with your servants, who walk before you with all their hearts. You have kept what you promised your servant David my father. You have both spoken with your mouth and fulfilled it with your hand, as it is this day. Therefore, Lord God of Israel, now keep what you have promised your servant David my father, saying, You shall not fail to have a man sit before me on the throne of Israel, only if your sons take heed to their way, that they walk in my law as you have walked before me. And now, O Lord God of Israel, let your word come true, which you have spoken to your servant David. But will God indeed dwell with men on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built? Yet regard the prayer of your servant and his supplication, O Lord my God, and listen to the cry and the prayer which your servant is praying before you, that your eyes may be opened towards this temple day and night, towards the place where you said you would put your name, that you may hear the prayer which your servant makes towards this place. And may you hear the supplications of your servant and of your people Israel, when they pray towards this place. Hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. The temple that Solomon built is now complete. The Ark of the Covenant rests in the most holy place, behind the veil, and the cloud signifying God's presence has filled the temple. Solomon had blessed God before the assembly of Israel as a God who keeps his promises, a God who spoke to David concerning this temple being built by David's son, and has now fulfilled it. Having done this, Solomon now turns his attention to God himself and prays before the altar of the Lord in the presence of the people. This altar, since it is in the presence of the people, would be the altar of burnt offering in the courtyard. We learn something here that we didn't get from 1 Kings 8, the parallel passage to this, which is that Solomon had a platform built for him to pray on, which stood 5 cubits long and wide and 3 cubits high, corresponding to 2.3 meters long and wide, and about 1.4 meters high, or 1.4 meters high, or 7.5 feet long and wide, and 4.5 feet tall. This prayer is a prayer of dedication of the temple by Solomon, expressing the true feelings for God that Solomon had. Solomon begins his prayer by expressing to God an eternal truth. There is no other God besides him who keeps his covenants with his people or provides mercy to those who walk before him with all their hearts. Sure, there are other objects that men call gods, but those lumps of gold, silver, or stone do not keep any promises, because they didn't make any. They're inanimate objects. They can't show mercy because they are not alive. They cannot speak. Yet the God of heaven is not like that, for he can speak. He makes promises and keeps them. He extends an offer of mercy to the faithful and grants it. It was therefore Solomon's desire that God continue to look down upon him and continue to grant him mercy and keep the promise that he made David, saying that there wouldn't fail to have a son of David sit on David's throne if those sons walked righteously as David walked. Now from our study of 1 Kings, we found out that by this time Solomon would have had a son who succeeded him as Rehoboam, would be 41 years old when he began to reign, and Solomon reigned for 40 or so years. So Solomon's request of the Lord here was that for Rehoboam to be able to sit on David's throne. But note that even Solomon knew that that promise was conditional on faithfulness. And at this specific moment in time, Solomon was faithful. But also from 1 Kings we learned that later Solomon began worshiping other gods. And so we saw that that fact affected the promise of God made to David. Solomon, though, was confident that God was a God who kept his promises, and would, in regards to this promise, made to David as well. But since the true God of heaven is not like the false gods that men and women make, another truth is that he cannot be contained by any temple that man can make him. With false gods you can build a temple, place the idol there, and the building contains the idol. But the true God cannot be worshipped by things man makes. He is not an idol. He is spirit, and as spirit, an earthly building cannot contain him. He resides in heaven, his spiritual abode. It is the same thing that Paul says in Acts 17 to the Athenian philosophers. So with this being the case, what of this grand new temple? Well, Solomon pleads with God that he would always be mindful of those who worship him at this temple, be pleased with their faithful worship, and grant them forgiveness when they ask for it here through their sacrifice. And if Israel as a nation sinned against God and returns to this temple to confess their sins, that God hear their prayers here and forgive them their sins. In other words, Solomon is asking God to be present with his people in this temple, even though it cannot physically contain him, as he resides in heaven. And that is not a bad thing to pray for. We always pray that God will be present in our assemblies when we worship him, despite knowing that God is in heaven. And the scriptures do teach that God does dwell within the faithful and is present with his people when they serve him, even though he is in heaven. Solomon is therefore not asking God to leave heaven. He is asking him not to forsake his people, which God has promised not to do if his people walk faithfully. Now, to some who might quibble with Solomon asking that God forgive their sins even though Jesus hadn't died yet, we need to remember the promise of forgiveness of sins was extended to the Hebrews who were faithful, who offered their sacrifices according to the law. It would ultimately be realized when Christ died, but that doesn't mean that God couldn't extend the promise of forgiveness, or in actuality forgive sins before Christ died, because he knew Christ would die to pay the price for sin. The blood of bulls and goats couldn't remit sins, but that didn't tie the hands of God. The blood of Christ paid the price for all sins, and so Solomon praying for the forgiveness of sins here is entirely appropriate. In all things, Solomon knew that the God of heaven would do right, rewarding the faithful while punishing the wicked. We'll continue with Solomon's prayer of dedication, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 22 to 31, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.